give some context, shall we? All right, so as you can see right here, I'm currently working on a drawing which was inspired by a song called Out of Order, which came out quite recently by a UK artist. I'll put it somewhere in the video so you guys can listen. Love it. I think it's really cool. I think we're in such an amazing time for R&B. People can get really cynical about music and constantly, reference glory days and all this kind of stuff. People enjoy discussing sort of the decline of things, but I am actually sort of positioned quite optimistically when it comes to the future of art in general, but the future of music, because I've been hearing so much recently where I'm like, I think music is in great hands. I think that people, I think maybe culturally people are feeling the impact of a lot of limitation and a lot of structural helplessness or powerlessness. And I think it's almost counterintuitive when it comes to art. But I think that even though people are frustrated or they are fatigued of the same thing, or they feel quite unable to penetrate these kind of systems of power that, control the way music is made, distributed, and, who gets to make a living from it, and all of these different things that sort of span not just art, but I think just being alive in general in 2026. Although it seems counterintuitive, I do think that this kind of pressure cooker of conditions that people are existing in is actually producing some really amazing and inventive music. And so this song, it was no exception for me. I heard it, and it's an R&B song. But I think that, what I love about a lot of music being put out right now, which isn't limited to Gen Z, but I love that. I think Gen Z is kind of, I'm referencing them in this video because I think they've grown up in this kind of strange global and social condition, and they've had this mix of influences from the internet, but also different time periods being sort of referenced as subculture. It's just, I think that Gen Z has such a kind of unique and interesting vantage point of all of these different social and creative influences and movements and temperaments, that what they're making, I think, has really been capturing my interest, because it's sort of like, I don't think I can really put a lot of music I've been hearing into a definitive category. And I think that's because it's born of globalization, of the kind of how could I put it? Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, as usual. Anyway, so this song, really cool one, coming out of the UK. UK was already such a melting pot of global musical influences. And what I love about this song is that in many ways, it kind of feels like a very classic sort of R&B song. It's got this like longing to it. It's got this effusiveness to it that I think a particular time in R&B, I'm maybe thinking early 2000s, we had a lot of like music, Soul Child, Boys to Men, Maxwell, who am I thinking of? D'Angelo, Jagged Edge, a lot of, whether solo artists or groups. I think one way that I would characterize early 2000s R&B, kind of thematically, or more so in terms of its writing, is this kind of effusiveness. I feel like it was characterized by a lot of longing, and a lot of kind of shameless longing. I think that as I got a little bit older, as I sort of hit middle school into high school, R&B started making this kind of pivot, or mainstream R&B started making this pivot toward kind of more restrained, a more restrained sound, but also a more restrained kind of narrative voice in the writing itself. And I think like what I'm talking about is the difference between sort of a Music Soul Child versus like a Bryson Tiller, which I love both. This isn't a comparative type of video. I love both sounds, and I love both explorations that those kind of both tones of R&B sort of took on, and I think that they're a product of their time. But I think that the kind of Music Soul Child era of R&B was, when I listen to it, there's just this kind of unabashed like longing, or even sometimes begging, or it's very it's sort of putting all of your heart on your sleeve. And as we kind of make that shift more toward Bryson Tiller, more toward early like The Weeknd. I mean early The Weeknd. I mean like the morning era Weeknd, House of Balloons era Weeknd. I'm talking about Division, whatever. Again, SoundCloud era R&B. I think post, obviously Channel Orange. I don't know who to attribute that shift in sound to. I don't think it's one artist that sort of birthed it, but I do think that you'll know what I'm talking about. I think with the popularity of this sort of lo-fi R&B, more restrained R&B, that was kind of exploring almost like more interior themes, I would say. So the kind of early 2000s R&B was very sort of externally facing. It was, say, talking to an object of desire, talking to a girl, talking to a boy, but with this effusiveness and this urgency and expressiveness and desperation, or like begging, right? And that would be reflected in the sound. We'd hear like these kind of incredible runs, or we'd hear kind of really like lush instrumentation and really melodic sorts of like super melodic composition. And then as it kind of shifted more toward a bit more minimal, maybe a little less like technical, like technically trained, more utilization of things like auto-tune, or kind of reverb, or even recording sort of deliberately lo-fi, not having, removing things like what's called bridges, right? Just having sort of a verse and a hook, right? And maybe a chorus, but getting rid of the bridge, and the instrumentation being more sparse, but sort of the emotional impact being just as like rich, but coming from a completely different vantage point. It wasn't really, R&B wasn't seeking to sort of express the kind of external experience of love, heartbreak, whatever, all the themes that we explore so much in music. But instead, we were kind of getting this entry into it that focused on the sort of internal voice, the kind of the messages unsent, not the gestures performed outwardly, but the messages that, people want to say but don't have the courage, or, the kind of loneliness of love, or the loneliness of longing but not feeling like fully understood, the sort of like challenge, or the more self-protective dimensions of of vulnerability and things like that. And that contrast is a fantastic thing to really examine in music, because I think that those aren't just shifts in style, but they represent like a kind of cultural shift. I think they actually represent sort of the headspace that a lot of people are at, you know, or kind of shifted into. I think like love songs that I grew up on, stuff like Stevie, right, which you could kind of consider just like the genesis of early R&B. And I guess you could think of like the genesis of early R&B are things like soul, right, and all that. And so if you think about that, you can obviously think of like, well, for me, Stevie's like one of my number ones, right? But one thing that I think characterizes Stevie is like this. I think love songs didn't always hinge on the sort of complex or the interior. They sort of expressed themes of love and longing in a way that kind of explored the more universal aspects of them, the parts of those things that we can all relate to and kind of that are like immediately legible to each other, versus that shift toward the more so lo-fi R&B and the more interior, I guess you could call it almost emo R&B. I don't know how I would describe it, but it's just like, I think we really started seeing R&B used as a medium to explore almost like this sort of diary entry kind of vibe, this interior vibe, which sometimes, yes, is directed at another person, and sometimes it is this like shared thing. Sometimes the songs are an exchange, but often the songs almost feel like someone who is in conversation with themselves and maybe expressing sort of the full extent of their longing, their heartbreak, their loneliness, whatever, but they're expressing that predominantly to themselves. And so the listener is you're almost learning more about the singer and the performer. You're learning more about them via the music, versus like with a Music Soul Child, it's like you're engaging with how he's perceiving someone else, or you know what I mean? It's hard to explain it. But this shift, I feel like, is very, very apt, because I think that whether it's the internet, whether it's just a change in the zeitgeist, or maybe this emerged as kind of a counter to the more classic and earlier formats for love songs, I think that for whatever reason, this kind of more interior style of R&B, and not as, I'd say, technically proficient. That sounds like a diss. I don't mean that at all. These sounds are beautifully soulful and moving, regardless. But when I say technically proficient, I think you can see the connection to like earlier R&B. You can see the more direct impact of gospel and genre and soul, and genres that are very like unambiguously like vocally proficient, right? So we have like crazy runs, crazy riffs, lush, almost like composition, almost like an orchestra scale composition, except we're using like not orchestral instruments, into sort of like programmed instruments and things like a sound that feels like someone's arrived at it in their bedroom, and people kind of getting into this thing of not necessarily needing to have the most technically proficient voice to express a depth of feeling, not necessarily needing a huge scale, or like volume or sort of like expansive sound to capture a real depth of feeling, but instead almost leaning into the stripped back and the sort of sparse and the kind of lonely aspect of one recording in their room and just maybe feeling something and just needing to get it out, like a diary entry, sort of like capturing that sonically and that becoming part of the sonic atmosphere, and it kind of reinforces the emotional atmosphere of a song. And so it's kind of this whole thing of like application and style and limitation sort of becomes a signature and deliberate sonic aspect of some of the iterations of R&B that I've grown up in. And I've kind of watched and experienced that shift, both like in what I listen to, but also in myself. Growing up, as you know, things R&B and music initially sort of being more widely distributed, and you know, more artists being signed, to now a big, a kind of widespread understanding of like independent artistry, and people kind of releasing music almost like straight to listener, straight to consumer. So I think all these things in themselves are like a fascinating sort of, the sound of R&B, I feel, is like a fascinating mirror into the social conditions that have impacted and inspired the people making it. And so like as someone growing up, I guess technically Gen Z, I can kind of like see so many of these things. And what's cool is like now in 2026, we have so many artists that have grown up with this beautiful spectrum and contrast of, you know, of sounds, but then also a bunch of different influences from all over the world and so many different contexts. And kind of now there's this like melding together of all of these different things, which sounds on one hand like you can really hear the influences and you can hear what's inspiring this generation of artists, but also there's a quality to a lot of music I've been hearing where it's like it's very hard to place what genre it neatly fits into, which is wonderful. I think that it's because like when you mix so many influences together, you're inevitably creating something quite new. And I feel like I've been hearing like, it's like I can hear the echoes of something familiar, but what these artists are putting together is this entirely new and inventive sound. And I love also, I'm seeing so many of the borders that used to exist between genres have kind of fallen away. They've kind of dissolved due to internet culture, I think. And I think, you know, even though this has its pros and cons, the sort of the kind of impression before that you sort of had to exist so totally and wholly within one subgroup or within one subgenre, and then that had to be reflected in all aspects of what you listen to, what you wear, you know, who you're sort of socially engaging with. That sort of doesn't really exist anymore, because I think people are predominantly forming a sense of their interest and palette and creative identity, musical identity, stylistic identity, I suppose. That's being formed in the arena of the internet, in which many of those borders are non-existent or they're entirely conceptual. So you can sort of exist in sort of one subgenre of interest and incorporate into it its opposite. And so I think that's really cool in terms of the amount of fresh and new interpretations or sounds that I'm hearing. So like this song to me sounded all at once like a kind of classic R&B song. I could hear some of the melodic and the yearning and the expressiveness and the directness of early R&B, but I could kind of also hear in it there's kind of cool and like, you know, programmed or like slightly almost like futuristic or like very contemporary like sound sonically in the style. It was so sick. And yeah, what you get in the end is like a completely new thing. So anyway, I wanted to draw about that because I mean I'm expressing it in words right now, but I was like, how can I express my excitement about this without being able to make music myself? So it's like so I had to speak about it, I suppose, or to draw it. But yeah. Anyway, that's like an episode in itself, so I'll cut that here.